Welcome to the Culture Stew podcast. I'm Maria Marukian.
And I'm Roger Moriano.
In every episode, we will meet with practitioners, authors, and all around fascinating people who share their wisdom and insights on all things related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Hey, folks. It's just me, Maria Marukian, today. Our buddy Roger Moriano is away on a much needed vacation. So I'm flying solo. And I had the opportunity to interview a fantastic colleague, Vinay Kumar. Vinay is a leadership coach. He is a facilitator, OD consultant, fellow podcaster, and he's also a global nomad, wildlife stalker, and records collector. And on top of that, he also is a self-proclaimed early bird in a way that most of us are not. In fact, he said that the best time to get him to be coherent is at 5 a.m., which is very early in my estimation. But Vinay has done a lot of work with leaders, not only around diversity, equity, and inclusion issues and intercultural competence, but also focusing on the future of work and the workforce, on sustainability, on storytelling, and on mental and emotional well-being. So he is just a force of positive nature in this universe. In fact, his podcast is called Shiny Happy People, just like the REM song. He told me that he tried to get the rights to play the song on his podcast, but it was just a little too expensive for his taste. So Vinay and I had a wonderful conversation, though, about a lot of the intersections of diversity, equity, and inclusion work, not only from the US lens, but also how we apply this on an international scale. And as we have found in many of our conversations with some of our international colleagues who are doing this work, there's much more that we have in common than what is different. And yet a lot of times the differences really matter. The cultural nuances are important for us to be able to really sort of parse out and have a depth of understanding around. And at the same time, to recognize, especially when we're perhaps getting pushback from global leaders who are saying, oh, this DEI thing, that's a US issue. We don't have those problems here. One of the things that Vinay and I talked about was that these are issues that are relevant no matter where we are, no matter what corner of the world, even if they do potentially look a little bit different. And again, not just related to DEI specifically, but also thinking about the future of work, thinking about the importance of prioritizing the human side of organizations, and in particular, our own mental, physical, emotional, and spiritual well-being is something that is a universal human need. So I hope you all listen in to my wonderful conversation with Vinay Kumar. Welcome, Vinay. We're so happy to have you here on the Culture Stew podcast and really looking forward to our conversation today.
Thank you so much, Maria. Thank you for the invite, and it's awesome to be here.
So I was curious to know a little bit more about your backstory. So if you could share a little bit about just, anything that you would like to share about your sort of personal journey in doing this work. And in particular, are there any messages or experiences that stand out to you when you think about early in your life that have contributed to the way you see yourself, your identity, your culture, how you show up in the world?
Yeah, well, there's a lot in that question, but I'll try to keep that brief. So one is looking back at the start, right? I find myself, and I keep reminding myself how privileged I am to have had the exposure I did as a child. I am a global nomad, if you're familiar with that term. Born in India, but I left the country when I was 7 years old, moved with my parents to the Middle East, lived in different cities there, did all my high school there. So really from a very early age, exposed to high multicultural environment. Um, Moved to Europe for my undergrad. So I was doing my undergraduate studies and then worked in Europe for a while and then moved to the US for the graduate school and worked again in the Boston area, then moved back to the Middle East. And I'm jumping years here, right? And then moved to Singapore for a while, back to India, back to the Middle East, and then to India, which was my home country. So I kind of tell people I left India when I was 7 and I came back when I was 29. And that really, that exposure honestly defines me till date, because I consider myself a citizen of the world, though I have a passport from one country, but the outlook and the exposure and the adaptability that I had to put in place was really something that continues to define me today.
Thank you, Vinay. Well, that sets us up so well for my first question, because I can imagine that uh, because of your global nomad upbringing and the personal as well as professional experiences that you've had all around the world in a variety of different
Yes.
cultures. I'd love to explore the notion of global leadership with you. And in particular, you're an organizational development consultant, trainer, coach. I'm certain that you probably spend a great deal of time having discussions with leaders all around the world about what it means to truly be a leader. And sometimes I think we can be very narrow in our scope of what leadership means, depending on what cultural identity and what society we are coming from. So I guess my first question would be, what are some of the global trends that you see having a significant impact on leaders right now?
Yeah, global leadership, the term global leadership has gone through an evolution, right? Um, when I first started years ago, global leader was someone who had not just teams in one location, but had teams in other countries and other locations and managed them and traveled and all of that stuff, right? What and then you added the diversity of a workforce. You could be a global leader sitting in one office, but have a multicultural or multinational team sitting all around you. And so it did not mean you had to operate across geographies or time zones, but it just means you had to work with a really multicultural workforce sitting whether in the Bay Area or in New York or London or wherever it was, because people migrated. Today, it's a lot more of virtual teams and remote teams. And one big trend is something that I just faced last week. Travel budgets are gone. So the ability to get on a plane, do an offsite, connect with people, and really build those coffee and lunch conversations and connections has been minimized quite a bit. And so what I find is the challenge for many global leaders is how can you create those deeper connections without really investing in that face-to-face time? And in the pandemic, so many people were hired virtually and remotely and worked for 2 years without ever physically meeting their colleagues, right? And today, when you have the ability to go meet colleagues, people are saying, yeah, but why do we need to? So I just sense that that need for I used to term it travel dividend has diminished. Uh, and I think it's a shame. I personally believe those leaders are struggling without those cues. Don't know if that makes sense.
Absolutely. I see the same. I think that definitely the pandemic plus technology have shown us that we can work effectively from anywhere and that we can establish meaningful working relationships and be productive. But there is nothing in my experience that can replace the energy that people feel when they are in the same space together, when they have that collective shared experience physically in that same space. I could not agree with you more. So I hope to your point that the travel dividend is not completely eradicated.
No, I don't think it's going to get completely. People have just become a lot more mindful of when to use it, how to use it, how to leverage it. Before it was just, by default, people travel. But today, I think more and more people are figuring out, okay, let's be very intentional about it.
Yes.
And let's make sure that the time spent is really meaningful, right? Uh, just a week ago, or 2 weeks ago, I was in Singapore working with a group of 36 leaders who had come in from 18 different countries for a
Mm.
3-day workshop. Um, and this is the first time they brought them all together because the last two runs of this workshop happened virtually. And these 36 people were just saying, oh my God, this is amazing. And they were hugging each other and, the connects. And for the first time, I noticed for 3 full days, all laptops and digital devices were completely down.
Yeah.
And they were really being mindfully present. And the last couple of years working with different groups, when I was in a virtual platform, you could see in their eyes, even though the video was on, their attention span was multitasking. An alt tab was being hit while there was a discussion going on, checking a quick email. And it was
Yes.
just so amazing to see 36 people mindfully being fully present.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It's way too easy to become distracted and to try to multitask when we're sitting in front of not even just one, but sometimes multiple screens. Um,
Yes.
so in terms of, I'm thinking now more at a granular level, Vinay, around leadership competencies, leadership behaviors. And I'm curious to know, again, from this international, interculturalist perspective, what are you seeing these days in terms of the similarities as well as the differences in terms of how leaders from diverse cultures present as effective leaders?
Right. Yeah, that's a great point. I think let me talk about the similarities, right? First, I think so. I know for a fact that one of the things, it doesn't matter which part of the world you're sitting in, pace of change is so rapid right now that there's universally every leader is struggling with trying to keep up with that pace of change,
Yeah.
be it technology, business, economy, uh, whatever might happen. The second similarity I see is, and this is, I don't know, I have to put some thought to it. Uh, in the need for all of us to become much more inclusive of diversity and of different thoughts, uh, leaders are really struggling about creating those safe spaces where everybody can contribute. I think that's universal. It's manifesting itself differently in the US versus Europe or Asia. There's different pulls and pushes around it. And one of the other similarity is the need for being resilient, right? For being resilient and being also vulnerable. Mhm. Leaders was Being a leader was a myth, and COVID broke that down. Every leader had to connect. I had a head of HR tell me jokingly on during the virtual COVID times. He said, this is the first time that so many leaders and managers have visited the bedrooms of their employees without it becoming an HR case, right?
I
It's
love
just virtually, right?
that.
And got to connect with people's family members and pets and see their houses and stuff like that. So that barrier between leader and follower, I think, is broken.
Hmm.
So that's another big piece. So there's four uh, similarities. On the differences side, I think the cultural nuances that are around
Hmm.
have uh, magnified to a bigger degree. People are so it's no longer geographic cultures. It's also multi-generational subcultures, the uh, lifestyle cultures, people who are uh, struggling to get back to the office, and you hear the words RTO, return to office. And there are folks going, yeah, but I don't want to. Right. So trying to manage all of those is very, very different in different countries. So I think that's a big difference as well. And for leaders to figure out the nuance of, well, my team in Singapore is going through very different issues than my team in New York or my team in London. Because there's, I saw these micro communities that have evolved in all of these locations, right?
Absolutely. That is, I want to take what you just said and put it in a little bottle and
Uh,
share it with people, because I think that's such a wonderful condensed reflection of the similarities and differences that leaders are experiencing around the world. And we're so globally interdependent. And as you said, at the same time, even sometimes within societal cultures, within national cultures, there are, as you mentioned, so many microcultures and subcultures that exist. And what has definitely been at the forefront of the conversations and the work in the DEI space in the United States in particular has been an examination of those subcultures and identities in terms of who has historically and systemically been given and maintained power and privilege and status,
right.
who has not, and what are the implications of that. And I think that that notion of what is perceived as the norm and who fits into that societal norm, that organizational cultural norm, and who does not, and what are the, again, the potential implications, that exists at the global level, right? It just shows up differently
Yeah.
in a variety of different cultures, but certainly something that global leaders really have to embrace and be willing to explore at a more sophisticated level in order to be able to create those psychologically safe spaces for people.
Yeah, no, and to that point, Maria, the biggest challenge for leaders is how do they stay up to speed with all of these evolution, right? There's almost an information overload if you really think about it. There's every day something is changing, and the way we approach it, uh, and the way we operated before. We used to say that the way we operated a decade ago is not the way we operate today. Now
Yeah.
it's the way we operated last year or last quarter is not the way we need to operate in the next 3 months. And it's just the speed is so fast.
Yeah. How are you, to that point, Vinay, how are you advising or coaching leaders in terms of being able to maintain that rapid uh, adaptation?
Right. Yeah, that's one of the biggest challenges for many of them because one, there's a paucity of time, right? I mean, you've got to get your regular business as usual stuff done, and the leader has to be on top of everything that's happening. So the tip I often give leaders is don't go deep in, go meta, right? Step up, go up. And so the two, three things that you absolutely need to know and do is one, be very agile learner, learn quickly and learn to learn very quickly things. The second one is be a lot more honest in saying, I don't know and I need help. And that's another thing that leaders never did earlier, right? Everyone kept saying being a leader is very lonely. It's lonely at the top. Personally, I think that's broken.
Yeah.
Uh, it's no longer lonely at the top, and it's okay for a leader to go and say, "Hey, guys, you know better than I do what's going on on the ground level, and please educate me." So that concept of being vulnerable, I don't know, but who can help me find out? So creating those networks of connections, who you can reach out to, the support network that leaders need around them is so critical.
Yeah.
And I don't mean in the organization, I mean outside the organization. I
Mm,
think networks are so critical today.
yeah.
And the variety of networks you have is even more important.
I love that. So, learning agility, right? Being more
Yeah.
agile at learning how to learn quickly. Vulnerability, being willing and able to say, I don't know, and to seek support and advice rather than try to go it alone. And that network piece, expanding and broadening our networks outside of the proverbial sort of norm, right? Those folks that are coming even from the same, not only from the same organization, but often I see this with leaders. I don't know if you do as well, that leaders will maybe tap into a network of other folks in the same industry or
Yeah.
who have had very similar experiences in terms of their professional, their academic backgrounds, their worldviews. And although yes, that can be helpful in the short term in terms of getting some quick fix advice, how does that ultimately help me as a leader be able to really challenge my own assumptions about what is, if I'm
Yeah.
only going to the people who pretty much sort of engage in the same processes of problem solving that I do.
Yeah, no, and it's a great. I actually learned that from one of my coaches, uh,
Mm.
and I was telling him, "Is like, how wide is your network?" And he just burst out laughing. And I said, "What's wrong?" He said, "So funny because I was on a golf course with a bunch of other executives from other companies, and we were playing golf, and every single one of us was complaining about the stuff that we don't know, and we were just talking to each other, and none of us knew the answer. And by the time we got to the end of the golf game, we looked at each other and said." And when someone says, "So when are we meeting again?" They recognize saying, "We've got to stop hanging out with each other. We need new blood here because we need people who have answers to our questions. Because every time we meet, we just have more questions."
Mhm.
So they actually said that they started having conversations, and they said, "We're not going to do a golf course anymore. Let's go to where people have the answers." And they went and sat in a co-working space where there were a whole bunch of young entrepreneurs and started having conversations with them. And right. So it's sometimes so easy to be with your group, but
Mhm.
your group won't have all the answers.
Absolutely. Oh, I love that. That's such a great practice. So,
Yeah.
that sort of leads me to, uh, another concept or theme that I wanted to explore with you. I know that you've done a lot of work in terms of global education as well as intercultural understanding. And I'm wondering if you could share a little bit more about your experiences. And in particular, what do you see for the future of global education and exchange? What do students, what do professionals need to learn really to set themselves up for success in this increasingly interconnected, interwoven world in which we find ourselves?
Yeah, so you're taking me back to my old corporate avatar. Um, for a long while, I was in global education, and I used to work with US institutions that were going global, trying to attract international students to that campus or set up campuses overseas. And there was or there is an organization that I was very active in. It's called NAFSA, the Association of International Educators. Um, and one of the things that I saw as I was leaving that they were still very grounded in the brick and mortar institutions, right? Bringing people to campuses or taking the campuses overseas. Um, and study abroad had really taken off in a very big way. What I am seeing as a big trend is the foot is the exposure to another culture or a global mindset does not require any more or does not require the person anymore to get on a plane and go study someplace else. Today, the exposure through media, the internet, access, you have, and the brands that have gone global is much higher. So I live in Bangalore, and we were and still are partially famous for all the call centers that set up here early in the first wave of globalization. And you had a bunch of kids or youngsters sitting in India making calls to people in the US and selling timeshares or Time magazine subscriptions or helping people fix their computers and all of that, right? So business brought a big exposure and intercultural training. Um, Ironically, just about a few days ago, I did a workshop for a client that has to work remotely with uh, their counterparts in Australia. And when I asked how many of you have been to Australia, only 2 out of the 14. How many of you are planning on going to Australia? No one. But they're spending 8 hours a day working with colleagues in Australia, right? So this digital it's the experience is the biggest source of learning. And these conversations we have is how's it going there? What's your holiday? I mean, there's a practical things, but even learning about uh, media and politics and everything, right? So global education is no longer academic. It is life education, in my opinion.
Absolutely. No, I think that's, and when I think about the notion that you don't necessarily need to get on a plane or spend a year in a foreign country to begin to develop those intercultural muscles, it also, I think, broadens the opportunities from an economic perspective for so many more people around the world to be able to connect and learn with one another using technology. And, we talked earlier in this conversation about how you can't replace that energy that comes from being physically in the same space with others. Absolutely. And when it comes to building some of these skills, I think that we can do it just as readily when we are physically immersed in the culture as when we are virtually engaging in
Yeah,
it.
and down the road with the metaverse and AR
Mm,
and VR,
yeah.
people did, for example, in the pandemic, travel and go on virtual holidays. Now, you and I'm old school, Maria. When I go see a site, I want to go touch or at least look at it with my own 2 eyes, right? But yeah, but there's a new way of doing stuff.
Mhm. I was recently teaching a course to a group of graduate students at American University School of International Service, and one of the projects that a student group took on was to look at just this question: is there a notable difference between when it comes to global study abroad, going overseas physically, versus some of the sort of newer virtual study abroad experiences? And what they found was actually there was no difference in terms of the levels of satisfaction of the participants in these programs, as well as the learning and retention. So I thought that was really fascinating, because my hypothesis was it can't possibly be the same. You have to go there and eat the food and be in the space. And they said, no, actually, there are some advantages in many ways, especially for students who have not had as much exposure to traveling and living overseas, that this can be a really, again, that psychological safety element, right? It gives them the opportunity to begin to develop those skills. And in some ways, and I can attest to this as well, in some ways, when students or professionals do go overseas for a prolonged period of time, sometimes they just find their little cultural enclave and stay in it, right? So they actually don't get as much of the intercultural interactions and skill development as their counterparts who are engaging virtually, because they've found their little community and they're speaking in their language and hanging out with people who are coming from the same culture.
Exactly.
And not actually embracing what's immediately around them. So that was really fascinating to me, to think about the advantages and the opportunities that either the virtual or some sort of a hybrid approach can provide.
Yeah, and there's also another um, benefit to what you just brought up, right? I must admit that my carbon footprint
Mm,
was terrible before the pandemic. I mean, there were years where I was on the road about 200 days plus
wow,
in out of 365, and that was multiple years in a row. I
wow.
cannot imagine ever putting those kind of miles up again.
Mm,
One, from just I don't think I'm physically able to. I don't feel the need to do it. But I'm also much more conscious of the impact we have on the environment. And we say, look, do I really need to get on a plane and go there and burn all of this jet fuel? Yes, and you're seeing that, right? The airline industry is trying to come back. So again, I'm not saying I'm traveling now. But I'm not saying I don't want to travel, but I want to be more mindful, intentional, and impactful with that travel.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
So there's
such a great point. Yes. Um, so I was wondering, Vinay, if we could turn to something that you, I know, also are very passionate about and focused on, and that is exploring mental well-being, tapping into positivity. And I think this is so, you mentioned resilience earlier as a core leadership skill. And I couldn't agree with you more, especially considering how much turmoil we've been experiencing, not only because of the rapid pace of change, but also, there's so much going on in terms of societal, political, ideological conflict and polarization in all over the globe, and such a great amount of uncertainty, whether we're talking about environmental issues, refugee and displacement issues due to
yeah,
the environmental and global warming, uh, religious divides, political divides, rise of autocracy. I mean, the list goes on, right?
and
Um,
it goes on and on and on. Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
So long story short, there is so much pressing down on us, and especially for leaders who bear additional responsibilities in terms of ensuring that they are caring for their people and managing the bottom line. Um, how do we support global leaders in terms of their mental well-being? What does that look like in action? And what sort of advice do you give to leaders?
Yeah, it's mental well-being. Let's be honest, right? I've been in the game for a long, long while, and mental well-being, psychological safety, emotional health. A lot of these are labels that have emerged in maybe in the last 5, 6, 10 years, and more significant. They're being articulated this way, but they've always been around. We were just they just never got the attention it deserved. But I always just when leaders come in and when I start coaching them, I always go back to basics. And when someone says, my first question to all of them is, how comfortable, healthy, or happy are you? Right. And they kind of look at me and say, wow, that's an interesting question for you to ask me. Well, and I said, let's discuss that. Because if you go back to the definition of well-being, it is the state of being comfortable, healthy, or happy. And when we talk about mental well-being, it comes from the state of mind. So are we focusing on being here, or are we focusing on doing things and having things? Every leader I work with is busy, right? And my question to all of them is, how much time are you taking out for reflection and thinking about what your priorities are, etc.? And most of them say not enough. And so the first tip I say, make time for yourself. Uh, so I try to keep the conversations as pragmatic and grounded as possible. And very often, all they need is someone to remind them of these basic principles. And they kind of go, uh, it's simple. And I learned this from one of my mentors. He said, simple doesn't mean easy. He always used to tell me this. Simple is not easy. And that is uh, we go back to simple, and then we work on things that they can incorporate that makes it easy for them to operate. I know I was at a high level, but that's how I have those conversations.
Oh, I love it. Even just that notion of be, do, have, and how intentional we need to be. What is it that is ultimately most important to us? What do we value, right? I mean, as coaches, we talk about that all the time. What are your values? How are you living them? What does fulfillment mean to you? And how are you showing up in your day-to-day life in terms of those values and what's fulfilling? And if we're spending most of our time doing things that are not contributing to who we want to be, that's that needs to be realigned.
Yeah, no, and one thing, to me, the ability to have these conversations have become a lot easier because of the pandemic. That's the only credit I will give to the pandemic,
Yeah.
that it reminded people of what's important,
Yes.
right? And people are a lot more willing to have these conversations, or at least explore it and what it
Mhm.
means to them, their families, their teams, all of that, because we realized we didn't need half the stuff that uh,
Right.
kept we kept chasing before the pandemic.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. Um, how does positivity connect with well-being? I know, again, as you mentioned, simple does not necessarily always mean easy. So, common sense may tell us that those two are connected, but what does it really mean, and what does that look like in action?
Yeah, uh, I again, I heard a wonderful metaphor, right? Are you a glass half full or a half empty person, right? And let's start conversation around positivity. And I reframed that. I said, you know what? Can we just step away from this? Do we even recognize that we first have a glass,
Mm,
right? Uh, Before we even talk about is the glass half full or glass half empty? And the mindset of gratitude for what we have
mm,
is the foundation for positivity. If you're not grateful for the small things that we have, you'll never learn to be positive about things. Um, because positivity comes from some joy, and the joy is often, I mean, comes from the privileges that many of us have, and we need to be observant of it. So to me, positivity is mindset. It's the way we think. And positivity doesn't mean just go crazy, and you have to be pragmatic about it, but also just recognize that things could be a hell of a lot worse, right? I lost colleagues during the pandemic due to COVID, and that was just a huge, and family members actually. And it was such a huge hit to reflecting. And then when you kind of go, well, um, I came out a lot calmer than I was, and it became just a reflection for me that my positivity today comes from just being able to breathe
mm,
and being grateful. And when we have those conversations, we actually talk about what are you grateful for, right? Or what are you happy with? So and it's so easy to focus on things that are not going well, that's still could be better. Yes, you have to be restless for it. Base it on the foundation of what you should be grateful for. So
mm,
that brings a little bit of positivity into our lives,
yeah.
and that's the way I kind of frame that. Uh, and people are getting it, right? People are a lot more open to it.
It goes back to that be piece instead of do and
Yeah,
have,
just
right?
be.
Yes,
Yeah,
being
just be there.
and humbled by everything that we have, even when we have very little or when we're struggling. And
Yeah,
no, that does not necessarily uh, mean that we have to be forcing ourselves into this level of toxic positivity where we're ignoring the challenges or the conflicts, but more so that pragmatic view that you mentioned, right? That it is, I'm looking at the world through a very realistic lens, and I want to focus on what I do have the power to control, where I do have, it's that sphere of influence that we often talk
Sphere of
about.
influence, right?
I
Yeah,
get stuck
yeah.
in what I don't have, then I'm caught up in that cycle of, the do have be versus focusing on the be first.
Yeah, and if you watch the news rarely gives you good news.
Yeah,
Yeah, it used to be that there was this phrase, "No news is good news."
right,
It is so true.
right,
All news is bad news nowadays. So I actually say no news, not watching the news is actually great. But you also can't bury your head in the sand
right,
because if
right.
if you don't watch the news will find you, unfortunately.
Yes, yes.
Right? So
Finding that
just being
balance.
aware of it.
Yeah. So, Vinay, I wish we had more time because this has been such an amazing conversation, and I feel like our listeners are going to gain so much from your experience. I was wondering, as we close out, I always love to end the conversation asking my guests for some sort of call to action. What resources do you have to share, or tools, or just guidance or requests that you have for our listeners to really step into and embrace this notion of global leadership?
Right. So um, I'll say three things, right? If you don't mind, I'll cover not just global leadership, maybe even some of the other things we talk about.
Absolutely.
Um, so the um, first one, if you really want to be a global leader, is a sense of curiosity.
Hmm.
It, just be a sponge, and you may not like some of the things that you absorb when you're a sponge, but stay curious, not furious. Right? Stay curious, not furious. Just take it at face value. So that's a fundamental thing. The more you know, the better informed you will be, and you'll learn new perspectives. Uh, the second tip I would sort of give is find something, whatever it might be for you, that'll ground you and give you that little hit of uh, dopamine and anything that's positive uh, on a daily basis. So I have this simple ritual. I know some people say meditation and all of that. The first song I hear when I wake up in the morning or get into my exercise uh, is Louis Armstrong's "What a Wonderful World." That's every day. I've done that for like 7 years. It's the If I put on anything to listen to, the first thing that has to be is that. And just if you listen to that song, it just gives you a very simple grounding. For me, it works for me. And the third one is um, find someone who can be your sounding board. So I don't necessarily, I'm not going to suggest a coach if it works for you, but someone you can have a completely open conversation with and get tender and uh, brutal feedback. Because if you're a global leader, you don't want to be surrounded by yes people. You want someone who will challenge you. And if you find somebody who challenges you, hold them close. Don't let them go. They're hard to find. So that would be my third bit.
That is fantastic, and I could not agree more with all three of those uh, notions that you put forth. Thank you so much, Vinay Kumar. It has been a pleasure having you on. I would love to continue the conversation. If people are interested in finding you, I know that you also have a podcast talking about positivity
Yep.
and well-being. So, where can folks find you?
They can find me on my podcast, which is Shiny Happy People. Look for me on LinkedIn. If you search Vinay Kumar C2COD, and I'm on Twitter. I'm on all the handles, so you can find me through the podcast or through LinkedIn.
Excellent. And we will make sure to put all of those in the show notes as well. And
Brilliant.
Yes, thank you so much, Vinay, for sharing your time and experience with us.
Thank you so much, Maria. This is such a pleasure. I enjoyed our first conversation, and the second one's even better. Brilliant.
Great.
Stay safe.
You too.
Thank you for listening to Culture Stew. In a world full of podcasts, we are so grateful that you chose to spend time with us today.
Culture Stew is produced by MSM Global Consulting and hosted by me, Maria Marukian.
And me, Roger Moriano.
Are you interested in learning more about Culture Stew and MSM Global Consulting? Sign up for the Culture Stew newsletter at www.msmglobalconsulting.com and send us your stories or your questions at culturestew@msmglobalconsulting.com.
And remember to please give us a 5-star rating and review on your podcast platform.
See you next time.